Hello, my name is Krista Pauls, and my presentation is entitled Culturally Responsive Teaching for Diverse Learners. The main questions of this presentation are: why should adult educators teach in a way that is inclusive and culturally relevant, the theory and rationale, and how is this achieved, or practical applications. Before we begin, I'll give a bit of my own background. I've almost finished the ESL diploma, and I hope to work as an ESL teacher in the public school system. Culture is obviously of interest to me, but I want to clarify what this presentation will not be about. The focus will not be an ESL context, nor will it have specific tips on any one culture, such as how not to offend Korean students. We have to recognize that teaching is always a cross-cultural experience, because everyone occupies multiple overlapping cultures. Consider this quote from Mary V. Alfred. We live at the intersection of many cultures. I hope this presentation will leave you feeling better equipped to teach cross-culturally, however that manifests itself in your teaching context. Once we turn our focus to the learner versus the content, we're probably taking a socio-cultural view of learning. This is different from individual or cognitive-only views of learning, such as the transmission perspective. A sociocultural perspective on learning would say that there are broader influences on learning than whether the learner is capable or if the concept is broken down well enough. For the purposes of this presentation, these sociocultural concepts are most relevant. First, that learning is constructivist. It builds on existing knowledge and schema. Learning is situated. There is the greater society and cultures in play. And that knowledge is socially constructed. Contrary to objective views about knowledge, sociocultural theorists would say that knowledge is mediated by culture. So, adopting a sociocultural approach to teaching, then, would involve things like getting to know your learners, activating prior knowledge, and being flexible with diversity. At the very least, sociocultural theorists would say that by ignoring diversity, a teacher fails to maximize learning. But moving into the domain of social reform, we go from neutral differences to analyzing how these differences are weighed and valued. In other words, there are no neutral differences. Here we move into power relationships, politics in the classroom. Some concepts that might fall under this umbrella are privilege, valuing one culture over another, one way of learning, one type of assessment, etc. What happens when one way is dominant over others in our classrooms? This could be overt, but more often it's subtle or even unconsciously manifested. Positionality. Alfred defines this as how your lived position, your past, your present, influences your worldview, learning, and performance. What happens when teachers occupy similar or different positionality as their students, or even this between students? Cultural capital refers to the culture-based assets a student has, and whether that capital is valued or devalued in a particular setting. And relating to this, voice and silencing. Are some voices silenced while others are privileged? Whose identity is validated in the classroom? We'd like to think we're open-minded in this multicultural country, but let's pause to consider some of our own preferences and expectations in a classroom. What ratio of teacher talk to student talk do you expect? How do you expect the instructor to dress and relate to his or her students? Can you voice disagreement with your instructor in class discussion? Should there be participation marks? Should assessment scores derive from tests or assignments, or a mix of both? Of course, we have preferences based on our individual personalities. Maybe you're talkative or quieter. But what I'm getting at here is that there are broader, culture-based expectations in play, with some ways favored over others. Our Western academic culture typically favors interactive and collaborative learning. It features more student-directed learning and therefore has less of a top-down structure than other cultures. For a good read on sociocultural theory, this is a helpful case study. Alfred shows that culture-based differences can become hindrances to learning, and these go far beyond issues of language. It's important to remember that differences can become blocks to learning, and can hinder a student's full participation and success in the learning community. Given all of this focus on difference, what hope is there to build a common class culture for learning? Already we've looked at rationale from the sociocultural and social reform perspectives. Ginsberg and Lodkowski add another factor, motivation. They propose that this is where we find common ground. It is part of human nature to be curious, to be active, to initiate thought and behavior, to make meaning from experience, and to be effective at what we value. These primary sources of motivation reside in all of us, across all cultures. When students can see that what they are learning makes sense and is important, their intrinsic motivation emerges. Moving into the how of engaging diverse learners, here is Ginsberg and Lodkowski's motivational framework for culturally responsive teaching. We briefly saw this back in week 2, but I want to elaborate and discuss some practical applications. There are 4 basic principles. Beginning in the upper left, establishing inclusion. This is where a learning community develops. Here, learners and instructors connect to each other and feel respected by each other. As we'll see, strategies here emphasize understanding, validation, and collaboration. Next, developing positive attitudes towards learning. Learners are engaged when content is perceived as relevant and important. Having choice is connected to motivation. Third, enhancing meaning via learning experiences that are engaging and challenging, at the right cognitive level for students, and connected to their world. Learners should be inspired to critical thought and action. And last, engendering competence. This is defined as getting a sense that learners are becoming more effective and involved in their learning, particularly when the knowledge is viewed as valuable and authentic to their world. Here we find assessment. How do learners and instructors gauge that learning has happened? If this model seems broad, it's because this framework is trying to build a common culture out of diversity across all disciplines. This quote shows how they are trying to account for everything from individual cognition to background to the context. It doesn't seem very specific at the outset, and it won't say, start your lesson this one way to engage all your learners, or all cultures can be assessed this way. Instead, these are guiding principles with matching instructional tools that a teacher can choose from to engage diverse learners. Let's put some meat on these bones and consider specific procedures and structures you could implement to reflect these guiding principles. Establishing inclusion. As I mentioned, this relates to respect and connectedness. Procedures and structures that promote this could include sharing, collaborative and cooperative learning in groups, peer teaching, establishing ground rules, and inviting feedback on your own teaching practices. To develop positive attitudes towards learning, it's about relating to personal experience and allowing choice. Make sure the learning goals are clear, but show flexibility in teaching and learning pathways. Teach to multiple intelligences. Incorporate all the senses. Touch base via regular student-teacher conferences for goal setting and feedback. Use learning contracts. Open up opportunities for experiential learning. Meaning is enhanced through problem posing and critical questioning. Use investigations and case studies. Design projects that feature experimental inquiry. Peer questioning can also be rich, but the authors note that this should be guided to be effective. Generating competence relates to meeting the criteria, but using different ways of arriving there. Design assessments that are authentic and contextualized to learners' lives. Tools for monitoring are helpful when different formats need to match the same criteria. These could be checklists, rubrics, etc. Self-assessment tools like portfolios give insight into one's learning process. Feedback is critical, which is where conferencing is useful. Ultimately, having more transparency in your assessment process and even opening it up to input or critique empowers learners. It's difficult to give one teaching approach that can be effective for all learners. The main message seems to be to let individuals be individuals as much as possible in adult education. As much as you can establish respect and validation, choice, personal relevance, and individualized assessment within the parameters of your criteria, you will be approaching adult education with a concern for cultural responsiveness. To make some of our own connections to these concepts, let's apply what we've learned to something we have in common, this course. In many ways, this course has embodied these principles of culturally responsive teaching. In our discussion this week, I'd like you to select one procedure or structure of this course that reflects these principles, and comment on how you feel this procedure or structure has met the needs of a diverse group of adult learners. For example, I might discuss how allowing students to choose their own topics for their presentations gives us the chance to pursue topics of personal relevance. However, having to check in with the instructor about the topic and do a presentation checklist upholds the criteria. Criteria is what inspires my second question. One critique of this approach is that it's difficult to reconcile a learner-centered approach with a set curriculum and criteria. What are some settings where it might be a challenge to adopt a more individualized, learner-centered approach? Looking at some of the tools described here, could you suggest some way to insert more cultural responsiveness into that setting? And if you really want to delve into the controversy, do we have to teach this way? Mary V. Alfred defines a responsible learning environment as a place where students can participate in the discourse of learning without sacrificing their personal and cultural identity. Considering the aspects of the social reform perspective, privilege, positionality, and voice, is a learner-centered approach truly the only responsible way to teach? Thank you for attending to my presentation and considering these questions. What follows are my references on this topic, and I look forward to our discussion this week.